Let's turn then again to Genesis chapter 18. That's on page 17 and verse 22. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord, and Abraham came near, obviously, to pray. So these words, Abraham came near, and of course the prayer that follows. The New Testament calls Abraham the friend of God. It also calls you a friend of God if you are a Christian. We'll see that in a moment. But there's a sense in which Abraham is preeminently a friend of God. And friendship with God reveals itself most intimately in prayer. Those who are God's friends speak to him as friends, and he speaks to them. And it's the intimacy in that relationship that comes to the fore here. Abraham, the friend of God, speaks to him. God speaks to him as his friend. And we have to acknowledge that Abraham speaks to him in probably what is the most unusual prayer in the whole of the Bible. I'm sure you felt that when we were reading it, that there is something quite unusual about it. The reasons for that we'll see as we go on. But it's useful perhaps just to pick up where the narrative begins. And Abraham is an old man. He's 99 years of age, and he's sitting at the tent door on a very hot day. And it was the custom on hot days at a mealtime just to wait for people to see if there were any strangers that they could invite in at the time. And I think the writer to the Hebrews is referring to that in chapter 13 when he tells us to be ready, always to be hospitable, to entertain strangers, because, he says, in so doing, some have entertained angels unawares. And I think the reference there is to Abraham. So he is a hospitable man, and his wife is a hospitable woman. You'll remember that is one of the qualifications for eldership in the Church of God, that a man be hospitable. It is also something that every Christian should be, one to another. And on this day, 3 strangers appear, and they seem more or less just to appear or to come from nowhere. Abraham offers them what he modestly calls himself a morsel or a bite to eat in verse 5. The reality, of course, is very different. He goes into the tent and tells Sarah to make 3 measures of fine meal, which is very substantial, and to make cakes. He also runs to the herd, chooses a tender and good calf, and gives it to a young man who hastens to prepare it. Now, all that is obviously going to take time. But you'll see the provisions that these people make for each other and how important, how sacred a thing, you could pretty much say, hospitality was. Our Lord tells us that to give a cup of cold water in his name will not go without its reward. And we should always consider it to be a privilege to feed the people of God. Always think of it like that. But any idea that Abraham has or may have, that these are just 3 ordinary people, is blown away by the way in which they begin to speak. As the meal is being prepared, suddenly one of them from nowhere just asks where his wife is and calls her by name. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And once he gets the answer, this extraordinary man who seems to speak on behalf of the three, he actually reaffirms the promise that Abraham had got 25 years before. "I will certainly return to you." Notice, I. "According to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Now Sarah, when she hears this, she laughs. That laugh is memorialized. You could pretty much say it's immortalized in the name she finally gave her son, which was Isaac, which means laughter. It was a reminder to her of her unbelief. She said, I'm past having pleasure, and my Lord, my husband, is past having pleasure. They were physically past the age of actually being able to have children. But the Lord rebuked her. Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. And from that point onwards, Abraham deals with the man in front of him as he was dealing with God, because in fact he is mysteriously dealing with God. This person refers to himself as the Lord. He takes divine attributes to himself. He allows Abraham to intercede with him, and he proceeds for the destruction of Sodom. This is the man, the God-man, who appears just at various points in Old Testament history, just on select occasions when something important is happening. This is the same figure that wrestled with Jacob by the brook Jabbok. This is the same figure who appeared to Joshua just before he was going to fight as the commander of Israel's armies. He saw this figure before whom he bowed himself because he recognized the commander in chief of Israel's armies. In other words, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the armies of Israel. It is what theologians usually refer to as a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord Jesus Christ. And Abraham recognizes that this mysteriously is God manifesting himself, what they sometimes call a theophany, an appearance of God. Now, this appearance to God here has a twofold reason behind it. First of all, there is an announcement of mercy, and that's just what I've mentioned before, that they will have a child. And Sarah, after her initial unbelief, believed it. We're told in Romans 4 that Abraham did not consider his own body already dead, but he believed, and he staggered not at the promise through unbelief. And he went in to his wife, and she conceived. So there's an announcement of mercy, but overshadowing that here, there's a staggering announcement of judgment. God tells Abraham that he's going to destroy the cities of the plain. 3 of them fairly small, but 2 of them large, Gomorrah and particularly Sodom. And these cities are going to be destroyed because of their sin, which had burst bounds. Ezekiel the prophet tells us that the sin of that city, Sodom, was laziness, pride, a disregard for the poor, although they were wealthy themselves, and unrestrained sexual immorality. And this announcement of judgment comes, you would say, almost as an afterthought. When the 3 men are leaving Abraham's tent, and Abraham having got the promise, and Sarah his wife too, Abraham accompanies them as they begin to leave, heading in the direction of Sodom. One of the men sends the 2 on their way, and he stays behind. He stands there still, and Abraham stands before him, and Abraham draws near to him. And Abraham is conscious at this point that God wants him to speak. He's conscious that it's an invitation to praise. The Lord stands there simply, and Abraham recognizes he wants me to speak. He's calling upon me to pray, and he does so. And he's able to do so because he is a friend of God. And the thing that's burdening his heart is something that he has to take to God alone. It's to do with Sodom. It's to do with Sodom's destruction. And it's also to do with the fact that his own nephew, Lot, lives there, who's a man of God, and he's got his family there. And Abraham knows that he has to bring this whole situation before God. Now, friendship is important between you and God. And it's important to remember that you are friends. Prayer, you see, is a relationship-based thing. And until you understand that it is a relationship-based thing, your prayer will never get anywhere. You'll only ever have an emergency prayer in emergency situations because you're not conscious of this relationship between you and God. And like every friendship, it's based on trust and it's based on mutual respect. Now that may sound strange. Mutual respect. Do you respect God? Yes. You have to respect God. You ought to respect God, and you do respect God. But do you ever think of God respecting you? Do you ever think of that? Do you think that that is a legitimate way to think at all, that God may respect you? Well, of course he does, as his son and his daughter, and that will come through as we look at the passage. But Abraham being a friend of God, or being a friend of God, isn't something unique to Abraham. There is a sense, of course, in which he's preeminently the friend of God. James tells us that in his letter in the New Testament, the friend of God. But Jesus tells us that we are all that. You remember in the upper room, and we read it last Lord's Day evening, he said to the disciples, he says, I don't call you servants. That I call you friends. And then he gives the reason for this. He says, servants don't know what their master is doing. They don't need a reason. Their job is simply to obey. And the master is not concerned with the servant's understanding of the ramifications of what they're supposed to do or the reasons for what they're supposed to do. They are simply told, do this, and they do it. Go there, and they go there. Now, undoubtedly there's an element of that in our relationship with God. There is an element of that. It's not long since I said from this pulpit that sometimes God asks us to do things that we don't understand either, and we have to do them in faith. Just in naked faith, we have to be obedient. But normally that is not the case. God deals with us as with friends. Jesus said, I don't call you servants, I call you friends, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing, but you know what I am doing. In other words, I admit you into my secrets. I bring you into my counsels. I share things with you, even as I call you to share things with me. And is that not wonderful? Should that idea not dominate our prayers when we go to God in quietness and in secret? I'm coming to a friend. Indeed, I'm coming to my Father who is in heaven. I'm coming also to my friend, someone who expects me to deal with him as a friend. If you lose that, your prayers will be cold, they'll be formal, they'll be detached. They'll be full of fear, full of mistrust, and full of misunderstanding. See, if you're not a Christian here tonight, that's how you pray. If you pray at all, and some of you may have the sense to pray, although you're not converted and you're not Christians, but your prayers are full of misunderstanding and misapprehensions and fears. You don't really know the God to whom you pray. You perhaps have a caricature in your mind of what that God is like. And that's why for some of you, the only prayers that you may offer are what I mentioned a minute ago, emergency prayers to a God that you'll only speak to in an emergency, a God that you don't really believe exists. Or at best you're agnostic about it. He may be there or he may not be there, but that in itself is an evidence that you don't know him. I mean, you're speaking of a creative force, a creative power. The Bible's not interested in that. God is persona. God is a person, and if he's to be known as a person. It's not like encountering electricity or something of that kind. It's not just a potent, powerful force that brought things into being. It's a person. And praying to God is calling upon someone you know. You know. And God stays here as a friend with Abraham. And Abraham draws near to God as a friend. But I want you to notice in the prayer that it's God who really takes the initiative. It's God who takes the initiative. He stops because he wants Abraham to stop. And I want you to remember that the invitation to pray is always there for you. It's never your initiative in that sense. Come with boldness to the throne of grace. That's what you call a standing invitation. I mean, sometimes there's somebody around at your house. It's a person you really like. It's a person you're really fond of. And you say, look, you don't need an invitation from me. The invitation's there all the time. It's standing all the time. Any time you want, just come in my door. That's the kind of invitation you have from God. That's the kind of invitation that we have. Come near to me whenever your heart is overwhelmed and in perplexity. Lead me to the rock that is higher than myself. And we find God initiating this prayer in a marvelous way. In verse 18 you have a soliloquy, really, and it's unique. Look at verse 17. Listen to how God speaks to himself, right? Abraham doesn't hear this. This is God speaking to himself. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, which in Hebrew means I have loved him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, and that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And then God decides to speak to him. Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. And that's God revealing himself to Abraham, letting Abraham into his counsel and telling him what he's just about to do. Shall I hide from Abraham? Isn't that an interesting question? It's as though God somehow considers it improper for himself to hide it from his friend. The relationship that he has with Abraham is constraining him to tell Abraham what he's about to do. And there are three particular reasons why God has to share it. The first, I suppose, is to give Abraham peace when the event actually occurs. When God does a thing, he usually tells it first to his servants, the prophets. And God will find a way of bringing peace into your heart in the midst of the most troublesome storms. And he usually does it by some kind of word in advance. At least if you're in your place with God and if you're walking close with him, you'll get a word in advance. And you won't be taken by surprise when God's catastrophe comes, when his fearful works in righteousness overtake a family or a people or a city or a nation. He has revealed it to his own, and they have perfect peace because they trust in God. And when this terrible destruction eventually came upon Sodom, Abraham was at peace. Have you ever seen a man or woman of God in unusual peace when everyone else are losing their heads and in disarray and in utter and total confusion? It's as though they know. That man knows, that woman knows, because they are in touch with their friend who is the judge of all the earth. The second reason God wants to tell Abraham what he's doing is because he's going to train his children after him. Verse 19, I have loved him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice. Abraham's going to teach his own family. Through his family, he's going to teach the world. And the world needs to know the truth about God. The truth. And that is that God is a God who judges, and he judges righteously. It's a God who destroys sinners as well as saving those who trust in himself. And Abraham has to press that onto Ishmael, his son. He's got to press it onto Isaac. He'll press it onto Esau, and he'll press it onto Jacob. And in order to impress it on his mind, God unleashes this judgment so that Abraham will see it, and he'll know that God is to be feared. And he'll pass that on in awe and in trembling, not as a doctrine to be believed abstractly as part of a system of truth, but as something he sees himself, something he's conscious of, that God does visit sinners with a judgment of fire and brimstone. God does consume the wicked. Don't hide that from your child. I've met some people who say to me that they find it very hard to teach the doctrine of hell to their children, or that God judges and that he judges with an everlasting judgment. Well, don't give way to a soft kind of squeamishness, which exists in the world today, along with a strange capacity for horror at the same time. There's a kind of soft squeamishness. I suppose it's not surprising when most of us haven't seen war or concentration camps or anything of that kind. Your children will cope with the truth, friends. They will cope with it. You will find that they will process it probably better than yourself. That can sometimes come across in strange ways. I remember someone I know well who was he was going to teach his child about David and Goliath, and he was dreading reading the part at the end where David cuts Goliath's head off. And when he had finished the story, the child said, "Can we read that again?" Of course, that's close to the kind of thing I'm getting to. You see, the child will process it. God is a way of accommodating himself to the mind of a child. You teach judgment. You teach the reality of a lost eternity, and God will accommodate that into the child's mind, and they'll sit with it, and they will process it according to their capacity, because that's what God asks us to do. To veil these things or to hide these things is to do what? It's to put a false conception of God into the mind of the child. It is to sow idolatry. It's to sow a caricature of divinity, and sow that, and you reap the whirlwind, and your child will reap it for years and years and years, unless there's a dramatic intervention on the part of God. So no foolish squeamishness on that point. Take the truth and reveal it in proportion, with care and with consideration to your children. And that's why it was so important that God reveals to Abraham. In other words, when Abraham sees, in a couple of days' time, when he may even see the flames arising from Sodom, he knows that it's not just a providential event, it is a God-ordained thing that was explicitly related to the kind of life that these people in Sodom lived. He'll know it. You did this. And he will be in awe. And again, it's not just to give him peace and to make sure that he teaches his children, but it's also to get him to pray. It's to get him to pray. And one of the things he prays for is the salvation of his own nephew, Lot. And the Bible tells us that Lot's deliverance from Sodom was due to Abraham's prayer. If you just move forward a page, chapter 19, which has to do with Sodom's destruction. And if you go down to verse 29 there, that's on page 19. Verse 29, now listen to this. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Now, isn't it interesting? Lot is a Christian, but it doesn't say that God remembered Lot. It says that God remembered Abraham and his prayer, and he sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelled. How many events happen because God remembers the prayers of his people? You've no idea, neither have I. We've no conception of it. The many things that happen and don't happen just because God remembers. The many things that happen to you in the way of preservation and even of blessing, not because you prayed, but because somebody else prayed. Perhaps an uncle like Abraham, or a wife closer to God than yourself, or a son or a daughter closer to God than yourself. God remembered, and therefore he spared. Isn't it astonishing that the rise and fall of a city, that its very preservation or destruction could depend on the prayer of one man? One man. Someone God brings into his counsel and uses his prayer to bring his own purpose to pass. It's almost impossible to conceive of anything greater than that. Your prayers are often in your eyes what Hezekiah's prayers were in his eyes. The pathetic chattering of a corncrake. That's how he saw his own prayer. The pathetic noise of a corncrake. Isaiah 38. But it availed with God. It availed with God. God moves nations and kingdoms and the events of cities in response to the prayers of people like you. That's the thing, you see. That's the thing. You become fellow laborers with God and co-workers with him as he moves his armies according to his own pleasure, involving your prayer on the battlefield of this world. So God draws near to Abraham and he prompts him to prayer, and he says, there's an outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm going down, he says, to see if that outcry is based on truth. And if it is, I will know. There's an outcry against it. Who's making the outcry? It must be the people of God. And there's at least one in Sodom. At least one. And we're told that righteous Lot vexed his soul from day to day with the godlessness of the wicked. I suppose in a way part of us are inclined to say, why didn't you get out of the place? But sometimes it's not so easy to extricate yourself from what you get into. The best solution for Lot would have been never to have gone there in the first place. Abraham gave him the choice of ground, and he looked at the well-watered plains of Sodom, which to him looked like the Garden of Eden, and he chose it. And 1 minute he pitched his tent outside Sodom, and then you read that he had purchased a house inside it. That's what backsliding does. That's what happens when you get caught up in covetousness and business and whatever. Before you knew where you were, there you were. You were in it. You were a part of it. You thought you'd hang around the edges, and you'd thought you'd be safe. You thought you had the strength and the courage and the godliness to stand apart. You could be in it, but not of it. And lo and behold, you're sucked in. But still, he had the sense, at least at first, to be vexed day by day by the ungodliness of the inhabitants of this place. And God says, I'm going down to see if it's like what I hear. Now, that in itself is strange. We know that that cannot be taken literally. In other words, we know that we're not meant to understand from that God doesn't really know what's going on in Sodom. That is absolutely absurd. These anthropomorphical terms are being used, just human terms, just so that we understand what's happening here. And the main lesson God is teaching is this, is I'm not going to judge the place without it being obvious and apparent that it is right. That's what he's communicating. That is always true of God. He doesn't judge unjustly, as we'll see in a moment, but it will be seen to be so. I will pass through the place. I will investigate the place. I will listen to the people, and I will watch the people. And when it is evident before me, I will act. See, friends, God takes great care to represent himself like that, as holy in all his works, just in all his ways. And when his judgment comes, it's not because he didn't know, it's not because he guessed, he didn't judge too hard. He investigated according to truth and righteousness and the standard of his own holy law. But when Abraham hears this announcement from his friend, he's thunderstruck by it. Thunderstruck by it. And the God who stood still and unburdened himself to his friend is now the one who waits for his friend to take up the offer. And really it is an offer to pray. And he draws near to God. Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And I'm sure it must have felt like that for Abraham. Here is my friend. But what a cloud of mystery shrouds him. How hard it is to fully understand or to comprehend him. What a God this is when he can announce in front of me the destruction of all these cities of the plain. And so he prays. And in his prayer we see three things. We see first honesty, because friends always speak their minds. Friends always speak their minds. And there's no doubting, I think, that Abraham has a difficulty here, because for him, the judge of the earth will always do right. He quotes that. It's axiomatic with him. Whatever else is true, this is true. That the God in whom I believe, the God whom I worship, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, always does what is right. He's nothing if not just and holy. And now two things threaten that view. The first is the fate of his own nephew. What, he says? Are you just going to judge the righteous along with the wicked? Are you going to slay the righteous with the wicked? Verse 25. So that the righteous should be as the wicked? Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? He knows the choice Lot made. He knows that Lot chose foolishly, but he knows too that Lot is a child of God. He knows that. He believes it with all his heart, and he says, are you going to bring a catastrophe that's going to make no distinction? He's wrestling with that. We all sometimes do. And he's also aghast at the thought of Sodom's destruction. For years and years and years, Sodom was seen as a mythical city. Recently, you probably saw in the papers, in the news, that they think they might have found Sodom. I'm not sure whether that's the case or not. But one thing we definitely know is that it did exist. And that's not simply from the Bible, but within the last 40 years, the famous Ebla tablets were discovered, which mention this city. I think it's the only mention in tablet form of the city. But you see, it always happens. I've brought so many examples before you from the Bible. Things, people, places that their very existence was doubted, and it's only in the last 100 or so years that most of them have actually come to light. Now, in one of these Ebla tablets, there is a merchant's receipt, a merchant's invoice, and it's addressed to someone in Sodom. Now, poets, writers like to talk about mythical cities, but merchants don't send invoices to mythical cities. You can take it that there was a city called Sodom. But this city was a city, as I've mentioned, that's renowned for its wickedness. But the remarkable thing is that Abraham is concerned for this city. I don't know if you've really got that from the prayer. Sometimes people, when they talk about this, talk about Abraham's intercession for Sodom, and that's absolutely right. You'd think maybe on the one hand, well, he's only praying for Lot, but you'll notice he's not only praying for Lot, he's praying for the city. There were lots of ways of praying for Lot. He could simply have said, Lord, will you not please remove my nephew from that city before you destroy it? And there you have it, you see. As a prayer for Lot, that would be effective, to the point. But he doesn't pray that. He prays for the preservation of the city all the way through. Will you not spare the city for 50, for the sake of 45 or 40 or 30 and so on? Why? Why does he right to the end ask for the preservation of the city? Well, why do you think? You see, to you and to me, Sodom is a wicked city from long ago, a lost city from long ago. But for him, it's a place where there were craftsmen and there were herdsmen, there were artists and artisans. It's a place where there were men and women and children. And not necessarily everybody was as decadent as the people we met with in chapter 19. If you read it yourself, it's gory in the extreme. It's a place where two people cannot spend the night without the risk of being gang raped. It's that bad, all right, but not everybody was necessarily that bad. The danger was for strangers walking through it. You were doubtless a bit more safe if you lived in the place itself. I mean, Lot was living in it. Abraham knew people from Sodom. Do you know that? Do you know that with an army of 300 people, he rescued the king of Sodom from captivity? Do you know that? Bera, the king of Sodom, offered to give him so much as a reward for delivering him from captivity, but Abraham took none of it. He said, I don't want to be made rich by the king of Sodom. No thanks, he said. But nonetheless, he delivered him from captivity. And for Abraham, you see, it's not a story about the destruction of the city. It's people. It's people. Are they all to be destroyed? Every single one of these people? Is there nothing that can be done for them? Is there no hope for them? If we heard tonight that something was going to come upon the city of Glasgow, would you not feel something the same? Maybe there are times when all you can see is the nightclubs and the sickness and the spew and the vomit and the sexual immorality and the knives. But other times you look at the families and you look at the houses and you look at the people and you say, is it all going up in flames? Is it all to be destroyed? And that should weigh on you and weigh on me. I don't know if it happened, I'm told that the Archbishop of Canterbury's faith was shaken by the deaths in Paris when 145 people were killed. The Archbishop of Canterbury seems to be shaken by not very much, really. I mean, is that really it? 145 odd people? Yes, it's a loss and a tragedy. What about the 30,000 who were massacred in 1572 so the streets of Paris ran with blood? Simple, godly Protestants who were just massacred out of existence overnight. Has he not walked, the Archbishop of Canterbury, even in his mind, through Belsen or Auschwitz or any of these places? Has he not visited in his mind the Spanish Inquisition and the torture chambers in the name of the Church of God? There are plenty things of that kind. We don't need to look to a relatively small group of incidents and say that our faith is shaken. If it's shaken by that, we haven't looked at God face to face. We haven't really got to know God, and we haven't really understood him. Not at all. This is the God who will summon the whole cosmos to his judgment seat and consign a good portion of them to a lost eternity. And does the death of somebody shake your faith? Then you have never considered the judgment of God. You have never considered his character properly or fully. You have never understood holiness, the real opposition between truth and lie and goodness and evil. No, you don't understand any of it. Makes you wonder if the Archbishop himself has really looked God in the face. Yes, you have to look at God sometimes in that capacity. But you see, what God says is, take it to me. Take your questions to me. Take your concerns to me. Come in prayer. Come into the sanctuary. Come into the presence of my holiness. Come honestly as a friend, and I'll deal with you. And that's the only place you get answers to that. I myself begin with the axiom that the judge of the earth will do right. But there's many a valley I've passed through. Many a valley I've passed through, questioning many a thing, until I come to my resting place. What's that? That the judge of the earth shall do right. I end where I begin. I know the universe is in safe hands. And I know that God does not do anything that is unjust or unholy. But Abraham comes with the honesty of a friend. And if you've got questions about the destruction of anything or anyone or something close to you, bring it honestly to God. Bring it honestly to your friend. He's also got the boldness of a friend. A friend is bold. He pleads for the city. We can understand him praying for Lot. But why the city? Why does he say 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? Well, it's on the principle, you see, that you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. In other words, while you live, Jesus says, I preserve this earth. You are light in a dark world. Were it not for your presence, the world would be consumed and destroyed. That's what he says to Christians. And effectively, Abraham is saying, are there not even 10 people? Is there no hope for this place? I mean, is there not a remnant? It's the principle of the remnant, you see. Is there not a remnant in Sodom that can change it or make it better? Sad to say there wasn't. I mean, Abraham's prayer, for whatever reason, stopped at 10. God didn't let it go down to 1. If he had let it go down to 1, he would have had to spare Sodom. But God didn't let him. He stopped at 10. The fact is that there wasn't 2 handsful of Christians in Sodom. That's how bad the situation had got. And the cry of wickedness that had reached God's ears was a cry that made him say, enough. You know, it takes a lot for God to say enough. God tells us to long suffer people, and we patiently endure with each other. I hope I endure you and that you endure me. We need to endure each other a lot. We need to long suffer each other. But when God tells us to long suffer, God knows what long suffering is. When he consigned Israel to Egypt for 400 years, why were they 400 years in Egypt? Because he was giving Canaan 400 years to turn from their corruption and their immorality and their wickedness. And only when their cup was full, when it was overflowing with human sacrifice, utter degradation, and total sexual corruption, did God bring Israel back and make them the executioners of that godless people. But 400 years, while his own people were in a furnace, he gave them space to breathe and space to turn and space to repent. 400 years. And he's given Sodom time. It's just that it's time up. It's time up. The cup of iniquity is full. And one day, you see, yours will be full. You who presume on God's mercy, you who think it's bound to visit you, you who think deep down that you're so good that God's bound to forgive you, one day it'll be over. The fact of the matter is that for all you know, you're spared today because of the prayer of somebody close to you. Because there is one righteous person in your family, God is being gracious to you. Because of the prayers of your uncle, God is being gracious to you. And that person dies. And that prayer stops. Have you ever thought about it like that? But there's a time when God says, cut it down. Why should it cumber the ground anymore? And he'll cut you down. He'll cut a city down. His judgment comes. I read once long ago that when God is judging a people, that his hand, ready to smite, trembles as though he just could hardly bring himself to do it. But when it comes down, comes down with such severity that there's no escape from it. And is that not a call to you as a Christian to pray earnestly for the preservation of your family and for the preservation of your city? Notice how Abraham is so bold, 50, 45, 40. He says, I want to keep on, 30, 20, and 10. Last of all, briefly, the prayer has the trust of a friend. Abraham stops at 10. Why? I don't know. I think the deep and true answer and the ultimate answer to that is because God stopped him. How that works in the mind of Abraham, I don't know, but God stopped it. God left off talking with Abraham. That's how the chapter ends, that God left off talking with Abraham. But I think that's because Abraham stopped. And why did he stop? Well, I think because he found rest. He knew that if there was anything to be gained by sparing Sodom, God would spare it. That's it, you see. That's effectively what God's answers tell Abraham. Yes, he says, if there's 20, 10, I'll spare it. But God didn't spare Sodom. And that's because there was nothing to be gained by sparing it. There was more to be gained in his divine economy by allowing it to be destroyed and the message to percolate. That God is holy in all his ways, just in all his works. So why allow Abraham to pray at all? Well, first of all, for Lot's sake, yes. But why does he allow Abraham to pray for the city at all, when it was his will to actually destroy it? I mean, normally when God lets us pray for a thing, it's in order to bring the thing to pass. He uses our prayers to bring it to pass. I mentioned that before. But why allow him to pray and to pray and to pray for something that wasn't going to be? Well, sometimes when we ask these questions, we reveal that we have views of prayer that are defective. Very often we see prayer as a kind of shopping list of things we want or need. Or sometimes it becomes an endless and rather banal series of thank yous for rather meaningless things. Real prayer is about much more than that. Real prayer is about growth. It's about understanding God. It's about knowing God better. It's about communion and it's about fellowship. And I've no doubt that when Abraham walked back to his tent that day, he was a different man from the man who walked out with God. I'm quite sure that his vision of God grew, his awe grew, his understanding of God grew. Abraham grew himself. He met God in a way in which he hadn't really met him before. And that's why sometimes it's not the answer that matters to prayer. It's the thing itself that matters. It's the thing itself. And what you need more than anything else is this relationship with God to grow and to develop. By all means, pray. Intercede for the lost. There is only one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Pray for them, that they would know him and hear of him and be converted. Feel the burden of the lost. Feel the awfulness of a lost eternity. Let these things fuel your prayers, but remember that the answer lies in the sovereignty of God, who will always do what is right, but may not be according to your expectation. But let the prayer make you grow. Let it deepen your understanding. Let it deepen your love and be in reverence before our God. Let us pray. O Lord, our God, we pray to remember that you are God and we are but creatures from your hand. Who can comprehend your works and your ways, even if you do reveal things to your servants? Even if there are things that you do not hide, but are constrained to reveal to your friends, yet how little we know. We only touch the hem of a garment. We are only paddling, as it were, on the shore of a vast ocean. We pray to remember that you are always the judge of the earth, and that you will always do what is right. And whenever our hearts are overwhelmed and in perplexity, help us to take our footing on that, on Jesus Christ, the righteous one. In his name, amen.